At the boundary where measurement instruments cease to function, the first scientist stops. He has built elegant equations around observable matter: mass, velocity, charge, force. And he calls the result a complete description of reality. He is celebrated, tenured, and certain. The second scientist pushes one level deeper, past the particle, past the wave, past the last threshold where any instrument can follow, and finds something that does not appear in the first scientist's equations. Not empty space, not random energy, a substance that thinks, a medium that listens, a fabric of existence that does not merely exist in the presence of a conscious mind. It responds to it. Wallace Wattles did not write a philosophy book. He wrote a physics of consciousness, a precise, structural account of how the invisible substance underlying all matter responds to the human mind with the obedience of a faithful instrument awaiting its operator's command. Modern materialism teaches that the universe is fundamentally indifferent, that matter obeys fixed mechanical laws, that consciousness is a byproduct of biology, and that the idea of a physical world that responds to thought is superstition dressed in spiritual language. This assumption is not examined, it is inherited. It passes from institution to institution, from textbook to textbook, with the quiet authority of a dogma so thoroughly embedded in the structure of educated thought that most people never once pause to ask whether it is true or merely convenient. The comfort of a mechanical universe is, after all, the comfort of a universe that owes you nothing and demands nothing of you in return. It excuses inaction. It neutralizes accountability. It transforms the question of why your conditions are what they are into a question with no meaningful answer, which is, for many people, the most tolerable answer of all. Wallace Wattles published a direct, systematic refutation of this assumption in 1910, and built his refutation not on faith, but on a precise, falsifiable claim. There exists a thinking substance from which all things are made. It fills all of space. It responds to thought with creative precision. And the evidence is the predictable, repeatable, lawful results that follow when a human mind engages it correctly. Wattles was not constructing a theology. He was not inviting meditation or private communion with the divine. He was describing a mechanism, one with identifiable inputs, identifiable conditions, and identifiable outputs. And he was doing so with the clinical confidence of a man who had tested his hypothesis against reality and found it to hold. The question he placed before his reader was not one of belief. It was one of willingness to observe. What distinguishes Wattles from every motivational writer who followed him is precisely this refusal to soften the claim. He did not say that positive thinking tends to produce better outcomes. He did not suggest that mental clarity is associated with greater success. He stated, with the flat authority of a physicist describing gravity, that the substance of the physical world is responsive to thought. That this responsiveness is not a spiritual gift available to the elect, but a natural law available to anyone willing to learn its conditions. The radicalism of this position lies not in its mysticism, but in its precision. Wattles was not asking for your wonder. He was asking for your attention, the kind of attention one gives to a law that was already operating before you understood it, and will continue to operate whether you understand it or not. In what follows, we will enter Wattles's secret science, the precise physics of the relationship between the human mind and the formless substance that underlies all matter. This is not a survey of his ideas, nor a celebration of his legacy. It is a structural examination of the mechanism itself. the specific architecture by which thought impresses itself upon the responsive substance of the universe and causes the physical world to rearrange its conditions around a clearly held intention. We will move through this mechanism with the care it demands, because the care is itself part of the operating principle. A man who understands this science only approximately will operate it only approximately. And approximate results will confirm, in his mind, that the law is uncertain, when in fact only his application was. We will show you exactly how the mechanism works, why it produces the results it does, and what the specific conditions are under which your mind commands the physical world to rearrange itself around your intention. Not as magic, but as the operation of the most fundamental law in the universe. We will also show you precisely where and why most people interrupt the physics, the specific failures of thought, the specific reversions to an older and lesser mental posture that cause the mechanism to continue operating faithfully while delivering outcomes the man neither chose nor desired. Because the substance does not distinguish between the man who understands the law and the man who does not. It obeys both with equal precision. The only variable is the quality of the instruction it receives. Before we proceed, one condition must be established between you and this material. The knowledge you are about to receive is not new in the sense of being recently discovered. It is ancient in its principle and precise in its application. And its precision is what separates it from the vast archive of ambiguous spiritual counsel that fills the libraries of human history. What Wattles gave the world in 1910 was not a new feeling about the universe. It was a map, a working schematic of the causal relationship between mind and matter, drawn with enough specificity that any man or woman willing to follow it exactly can arrive at the destination it describes. Hold that distinction as you proceed. The difference between a map and a poem about landscape is the difference between arriving and wandering. This is a map. Use it accordingly. If this science belongs in your life, and the evidence will make clear whether it does. Subscribe to this channel and remain with us as we continue to excavate the teachings of the masters who drew these maps before the modern world. Learn to forget them. Wattles begins with a claim that is simultaneously ancient and radical. All things are made from one original substance, and that substance thinks. Not metaphorically, actually. This is not the poetic assertion of a mystic gesturing toward unity. It is a structural proposition about the nature of physical reality, stated with the directness of an axiom and treated with the logical consistency of a first principle. To grasp what this means is to grasp the entire architecture of the secret science. For every other principle Wattles articulates flows from this one, with the necessity of geometry flowing from its axioms. If the substance from which all things are made is inert, mechanical, and indifferent, then the rest of his science collapses. But if the substance thinks, if responsiveness to mind is a fundamental property of the fabric of existence, then everything that follows becomes not merely plausible, but inevitable. The formless substance, in Wattles's account, is not a region of the universe. It is not a special material found in rare conditions or accessible only through extraordinary means. It permeates every point in space, underlies every particle of formed matter, and maintains an active, living relationship with the thinking beings that inhabit the world it composes. Consider what this means in physical terms. Every object you can see, touch, measure, or interact with is a specific formation of a substance that, in its original state, has neither fixed form nor fixed limit. The chair, the tree, the coin, the body. Each is a particular condensation of the same responsive medium. The way a wave is a particular movement of a unified ocean. The forms are temporary. The substance is permanent. And the substance, in its original formless state, continues to exist beneath and within every form it has assumed, ready by its nature to receive a new impression and move toward a new formation. What makes this claim radical in the context of the 19th and 20th centuries, and in the context of the 21st, where the assumption of a mechanical universe still governs most educated thinking, is the property Wattles assigns to this substance beyond mere existence. It is not enough in his physics that a universal substance underlies all things. The operative word is thinks. The formless substance is not a passive medium like water waiting to be poured into a mold. It is an intelligent medium, one that receives impressions from thinking minds and moves toward the forms those impressions describe with something that can only be called purposive responsiveness. It does not react the way a billiard ball reacts to a cue. Through blind mechanical force, it responds the way a trained instrument responds to a skilled operator. Through the recognition and execution of intention. The analogy that illuminates this most precisely is Wattles' own. The formless substance responds to thought the way iron filings respond to a magnetic field. This is not a casual comparison. It is a statement about the nature of the causal relationship. Iron filings do not choose to orient themselves around a magnetic field. They do not deliberate, resist, or apply independent judgment. They respond lawfully and predictably to the field that acts upon them. And they do so with a precision that makes the result reproducible by any experimenter who recreates the conditions. The formless substance, Wattles claims, has this same quality of lawful responsiveness, not to magnetic force, but to mental impression. The thought impresses the field. The field moves toward the form the thought describes. The result follows as necessarily as the alignment of iron filings follows the presence of a magnet. What separates this responsiveness from the random, occasional, or supernatural is the word Wattles uses most carefully and most consistently throughout his work: law. The relationship between thought and the formless substance is not a relationship of petition and grace. It is not the relationship between a supplicant and a deity, who may or may not be listening. It is the relationship between a cause and its effect, the same relationship that governs every other natural phenomenon, except that here the cause is mental rather than physical. This distinction is the entire science. The universe does not make an exception for mind. It applies the same causal logic to mental events that it applies to physical ones, because in Wattles' physics, the mental and the physical are not two separate domains. They are two registers of the same responsive substance, and between them operates the most fundamental law in the structure of reality. Why then do most people experience the physical world as resistant, indifferent, and governed by forces beyond their influence? The answer Wattles provides is not that the law operates selectively. The law operates universally and without preference. The answer is that most people are impressing the formless substance with thoughts they did not consciously choose. Thoughts of limitation, of scarcity, of competition with a fixed and finite supply of good. And the substance, faithful to the law, is forming their conditions accordingly. The physical world feels resistant, not because it is resisting the man. It is obeying him, obeying the dominant thought he carries, the one he inherited from his environment and has never examined, The sense of resistance is simply the sensation of living in conditions that correspond, with perfect precision, to a thought the man does not recognize as his own instruction. This is the philosophical vertigo at the center of Wattles' secret science. And it must be allowed to land with its full weight before the mechanics can be understood. The world you inhabit at this moment is not a fact imposed upon you from outside. It is a form taken by the substance that responds to your dominant thought. The conditions of your life, your financial state, the quality of your opportunities, the nature of the people who appear in your environment, are all formations of the same formless substance, shaped and maintained by the dominant impression your mind has been making upon it. Some of those impressions were deliberate, most were not. But the substance made no distinction. It received each impression with equal fidelity and moved toward the corresponding form with equal precision. To understand the architecture of responsive matter, one must therefore begin not with the external world, but with the internal one. Not with the circumstances you can observe, but with the thought that is generating them below the level of your conscious observation. Wattles makes this sequence explicit and non-negotiable. Thought is the first cause. The formless substance is the second, the medium through which the first cause operates. The physical conditions are the third, the formed result of the first cause acting through the second medium. To work at the level of physical conditions without working at the level of the first cause is to spend your energy rearranging the last link in a chain whose decisive links lie in a direction you have not yet turned to face. What does it mean, in precise terms, for a substance to be formless? This is not a trivial question. The word formless, in Wattles' usage, does not mean shapeless in the sense of being chaotic or undefined. It means prior to form, existing in a state of unlimited creative potential, unbound by the specific configurations into which it has already condensed. Every formed thing in the universe, every rock, every organism, every institution, every relationship, is the formless substance in a particular state of limitation. It has taken on the boundaries of a specific form and now expresses its potential only within those boundaries. The formless substance in its original state has none of those limitations. It can take any form. It is, in this sense, the purest expression of possibility available in the structure of reality. And it is this inexhaustible creative potential that makes it the appropriate medium for thought, which is itself the assertion of a specific possibility against the background of the unlimited. The relationship between thought and formless creative potential has one more dimension that Wattles identifies with particular care. The relationship is not intermittent. The formless substance is not reading your mind at designated moments of prayer or meditation and otherwise operating on its own mechanical schedule. It is reading the dominant thought of your mind continuously. The way a compass needle reads the dominant magnetic field of the Earth continuously, regardless of whether the compass is being consulted. This continuous responsiveness is what makes the science both more powerful and more demanding than its students typically expect. It is more powerful because the mechanism is always engaged. Every moment of deliberate, clear, faith-held thought is a moment in which the substance is actively moving toward the desired form. It is more demanding because there is no neutral ground. Every moment of fearful, doubtful, or competitive thought is equally a moment in which the substance is receiving an impression and equally moving in the direction that impression describes. The architecture Wattles proposes is therefore not a system that can be practiced occasionally, like an exercise routine engaged on certain mornings and abandoned on others. It is a description of a law that is always already operating, a physics of mind and matter that has no off switch and recognizes no vacation. The question is never whether you are impressing the formless substance. You are always impressing it. The only question of any practical consequence, is whether the impression you are making is the one you would choose if you understood that it was being executed with perfect fidelity at this very moment. That question, held clearly, changes everything about how a man relates to the traffic of his own thoughts. Consider the implications for what we ordinarily call effort. In the conventional model of material achievement, effort is the primary cause. The man who works harder gets more, because more labor applied to the physical world produces more physical result. Wattles does not dismiss effort. He recontextualizes it entirely. Effort, in his physics, is not the cause. It is the channel through which the formless substance delivers the result into the physical world. The substance cannot materialize a new condition without a physical agent acting in the physical world. The aligned man must still move, still work, still engage with the concrete realities of his environment. But the nature of his effort is categorically different from the effort of the man who has not understood the physics, because his effort is being amplified by the cooperative movement of the substance through which all his conditions are formed. He is not pushing alone against a resistant world. He is moving with a medium that is already moving toward what he intends. This reframing of effort has a specific, testable implication that distinguishes Wattles' physics from mere philosophical idealism. If the formless substance is genuinely responsive to thought, then the aligned man should find, as a regular feature of his experience, that his effort encounters less resistance and more unexpected facilitation than the effort of the unaligned man working in the same external environment. He should find that the right conditions appear with a regularity that cannot be accounted for by chance alone. Not because the world is making an exception for him, but because the substance underlying his conditions is actively rearranging itself in response to his operative impression. This pattern of converging circumstances, the right person, the right information, the right opportunity arriving at the moment of readiness, is not anecdote. In Wattles' physics, it is the predictable signature of a law operating exactly as described. The final dimension of Wattles' architecture that must be established before the mechanics of impression can be examined is what he calls the unlimited supply. The formless substance does not have a finite quantity. There is no shortage of the creative medium from which all things are made, which means there is no shortage of the forms that can be created from it. The assumption that wealth, success, and opportunity are finite quantities in a competitive universe, that one man's gain necessarily comes at another's cost, is not an economic observation. It is a philosophical error about the nature of the material from which wealth is formed. You cannot deplete the formless substance. You cannot crowd it. You cannot exhaust its responsiveness. Every impression made upon it draws from an unlimited reservoir of creative potential. This understanding is not an affirmation to be repeated for comfort. It is a physical fact about the nature of the medium, one that changes at a foundational level, the posture from which a man operates when he begins to engage the law consciously. Matter, in Wattles' physics, is not the bottom of the causal chain. It is the last link in a chain that begins with thought. To see matter as the ultimate reality, as the fixed ground upon which human effort must work, is to mistake the last link for the first. It is to stand at the end of the causal process and wonder why you cannot move it while leaving the beginning untouched. The secret science begins at the beginning, with the thought impressed clearly and faithfully upon the substance that underlies every form in the physical world, setting in motion a causal chain whose terminus is a physical condition that corresponds, with the precision of law, to the form the thought described. This is not mysticism. This is the architecture of reality, and the man who understands it does not hope to influence the physical world. He operates the mechanism that produces it. The claim that a thinking substance underlies all matter would remain permanently in the domain of philosophy if it could not be subjected to the test that distinguishes a working hypothesis from a poetic intuition. Wattles understood this. His entire project in the science of getting rich was not to inspire wonder, but to establish the logical and empirical grounds upon which a man could act with certainty. The unshakable logic of his system does not rest on authority, tradition, or inner experience. It rests on the same foundation that any durable scientific claim rests upon: internal consistency, explanatory power, and the predictability of its results under specified conditions. When these three standards are applied to Wattles's central thesis, the argument that emerges is not merely plausible. It is, by the standards of rigorous thinking, difficult to refute without also refuting the observable patterns of cause and effect that govern every human life. Begin with internal consistency. The claim that a formless substance permeates all space and responds to thought is internally consistent in a way that the conventional materialist account of consciousness is not. Materialism claims that consciousness is produced by the brain, a byproduct of electrochemical activity that vanishes when the biological system ceases to function. But this account faces a problem that has not been resolved in over a century of serious philosophical and scientific inquiry. It cannot explain how subjective experience arises from objective physical processes. It cannot explain why there is something it is like to see red, to feel grief, to hold an intention. This is the hard problem of consciousness. And it is precisely the problem that Wattles's physics bypasses by beginning at the other end of the relation. If consciousness is not produced by matter, but is instead the fundamental property of the substance from which matter is formed, then the hard problem dissolves. Consciousness is not the output, it is the ground. Consider next the explanatory power of Wattles's thesis, its capacity to account for phenomena that the materialist framework struggles to contain. The man who holds a clear, specific, faith-maintained vision of a desired outcome and takes consistent action aligned with that vision tends to produce that outcome. Not always and not without effort, but with a regularity that exceeds what probability alone would predict. This pattern has been observed across cultures, across centuries, across the entire recorded history of human achievement. It was noted by Stoic philosophers who spoke of the ruling faculty's command over circumstance. It was described by Renaissance thinkers who identified the will as the governing principle of nature. It was systematized by the generation of thinkers to which Wattles belonged. Men and women who recognized that thought was not merely psychological, but causal. The materialist framework can account for this pattern only by invoking selection bias, confirmation bias, and retrospective attribution. Explanations that require the consistent and cross-cultural pattern to be a persistent illusion held by virtually every successful human being who has ever examined their own process. Wattles's framework accounts for it directly. The pattern exists because the law exists. The third standard, predictability of results under specified conditions, is where Wattles's logic becomes most demanding and most instructive. A law, by definition, operates the same way every time the conditions are correctly reproduced. If Wattles' physics is a genuine description of a natural law, then it must be the case that when its specified conditions are met, the clear mental image, the faith-maintained impression, the gratitude, the aligned action, the results follow with lawful regularity. Wattles is explicit that this is precisely what he claims. He does not say the results sometimes follow or usually follow. He says they follow as necessarily as the geometric consequence follows from the geometric premise. The man who fails to produce the results has not found an exception to the law. He has failed to reproduce the conditions, and in that failure lies the entirety of what he needs to learn. This point about the reproducibility of conditions is the bridge between the philosophical and the practical dimensions of Wattles' science. And it is the point at which most students of his work go wrong. They read the central claim, feel its resonance, and immediately attempt to operate the mechanism without understanding its specifications. They hold an image, but not a specific one. They maintain it for a day or a week, but abandon it the moment doubt arises, which is precisely the moment the impression requires the most faithful maintenance. They perform gratitude as a cognitive exercise, rather than inhabiting it as the genuine recognition of a responsive substance already in motion, and when the results do not appear on their expected schedule. They conclude that the law does not hold, when in fact the law held perfectly, registering every imprecision, every interruption, every failure of faith, and producing conditions that corresponded, with flawless accuracy, to the quality of the impression it actually received rather than the quality the student imagined he was making. The logic of this is, once clearly seen, impossible to argue with. And that impossibility is the source of both the science's power and its severity. If the formless substance is genuinely responsive to thought and genuinely indifferent to the man's intentions about his thoughts as opposed to the thoughts themselves, then there is no mechanism by which a man can hold a thought that produces scarcity while intending to produce abundance. The substance does not read intentions. It reads impressions. And the impression is not what the man tells himself he is thinking. It is the dominant state of his mind as it actually is. The aggregate frequency of his most consistent, most deeply held, most automatically arising mental content. This is the distinction between sincere engagement with the science and superficial engagement with it. And it is a distinction that the law enforces without mercy and without exception. Here, the reverse bridge must be walked precisely. The defining failure of modern intellectual culture is not ignorance. It is the specific combination of surface sophistication and foundational passivity. The condition in which a man has read enough to discuss ideas fluently, but has never pressed any idea to the depth at which it either proves itself against reality or collapses. He moves through his life with a mind full of frameworks, none of which he has ever truly tested, because testing would require the kind of sustained, exact, faith-maintained commitment that his culture has taught him to reserve only for externally verifiable procedures. Wattles identified this failure with surgical precision more than a century before it became the defining posture of the educated class. His answer was not more information. It was a higher demand. Engage the law with the exactness it requires, not as an experiment you can afford to abandon if results are slow, but as the operating principle of your existence, held with the certainty of a physicist who trusts the equation because he understands the derivation. The unshakable logic of Wattles' system is most clearly demonstrated by examining what happens when it is partially applied, which is the most common mode of engagement and the source of the most common disillusionment. A man learns the principle of mental impression. He applies it with enthusiasm for a period. The substance responds. Circumstances begin to shift. Openings begin to appear. The texture of his environment begins to change in ways that correspond to his impression. Then the competitive mind reasserts itself. He sees that the result has not fully materialized and concludes that the process is failing. He reintroduces doubt, which is, in Wattles' physics, not merely a psychological state, but a counter-impression on the formless substance, instructing it to move in the direction of the feared outcome rather than the desired one. The substance obeys the new impression with the same fidelity it gave the first. The circumstances that were converging begin to disperse. The man concludes that the law is unreliable. The law, of course, was reliable throughout. It obeyed every instruction it received, including the instruction to stop. Wattles anticipated this cycle because it is not a modern phenomenon. It is the ancient and universal failure of the man who understands a principle at the level of idea, but has not yet understood it at the level of nature. Who can speak it, but cannot yet be it? The transmission from intellectual understanding to lived principle is itself governed by a law. The principle must be held with such clarity, such consistency, and such certainty that it becomes the dominant impression of the mind, even under conditions that appear to contradict it. This is not faith in the supernatural sense. It is the application of logical trust. The same trust a navigator places in the mathematics of celestial navigation, even when the stars are temporarily obscured. The stars did not move because clouds appeared. The substance did not stop responding because the expected form has not yet become visible. The process is continuous. The law is absolute. The navigator trusts the mathematics and holds his course. To operate the physics of impression correctly, a man must also understand the relationship between the formless substance and what Wattles calls the advancing life. The principle that the substance moves not in arbitrary directions, but always in the direction of more life, more expression, more abundance for every entity it composes. This is not sentimentality. It is a structural claim about the directionality of a living, thinking substance. It tends, by its nature, toward fuller expression of its own creative potential. When a man's thought is aligned with his tendency, when his desired form represents a genuine expansion of life, value, and creative expression, he is working with the grain of the substance. His impression encounters something that has its own momentum in the direction he's pointing. This is why Wattles insists that the man who operates the science correctly must be genuinely committed to increasing value, to giving more in use value than he receives in cash value in every transaction. The substance responds most powerfully to the impression that aligns with its own deepest tendency, which is toward the advancement and enrichment of life in all its forms. The logic here is elegant and demanding in equal measure. It means that a man cannot successfully impress the formless substance with the thought of obtaining wealth through diminishment of others, through deception, manipulation, or competitive extraction, because such a thought is not aligned with the advancing tendency of the substance itself. He may produce short-term results through these means, working at the level of physical force and social mechanics, bypassing the impressional physics entirely. But he is not operating the law. He is operating its simulacrum with the temporary results that simulacra always produce. The genuine operation of the law requires that the desired form represent an authentic advance, a genuine creation of value that the substance, in its intelligent responsiveness to life, will move toward with something more than mere mechanical compliance. Consider the implications of this advancing tendency for the question of worthiness, the question that haunts most students of this science and prevents them from holding the operative impression with the faith it requires. The man who asks whether he deserves the wealth he is impressing upon the substance is asking a question that belongs to a different framework entirely. Worthiness is a moral and social category. The formless substance does not operate in moral categories. It operates in causal ones. The question of whether the desired form will be produced is not a question of desert, but a question of impression. Was the thought specific, clear, consistent, and faith maintained? Was it aligned with the advancing tendency of the substance? Was it accompanied by the actions that the aligned person's environment called for? If these conditions were met, the result follows, not as a reward, but as a consequence. The way the growth of a plant follows from correct conditions of light, water, and soil, not from the plant's having earned its growth. This reframing of worthiness as irrelevant to the operation of the law is not a license for moral indifference. It is a structural clarification that removes a specific obstruction from the channel between the mind and the substance. The man who is preoccupied with whether he deserves the desired outcome is not holding the clear, specific, faith-maintained image of the desired form. He is holding a tangled impression, one strand pointing toward the form, another strand pointing toward doubt about whether the form will be granted. The substance reads both strands and produces conditions that reflect the mixture. Partial progress, interrupted by apparent setbacks, yielding the frustrating sense that the law almost works but never quite delivers. Remove the question of desert entirely. Replace it with the accurate understanding that the law is operating a causal mechanism, not administering a merit system, and the obstruction dissolves. The channel clears, the impression reaches the substance in its pure, operative form, and the physics proceeds. The final element of the unshakable logic concerns time. Specifically, the relationship between the moment of the operative impression and the moment of the physical result. Students of Wattles' science frequently make the error of treating these two moments as though they should be closely adjacent in calendar time. As though a clear impression made on Monday should produce a visible result by the following week. This expectation is a category error, and it is the category error that destroys more applications of the law than any other single misunderstanding. The formless substance does not operate on a calendar. It operates on a causal sequence. A sequence that may require the convergence of multiple people, circumstances, and conditions before the physical result can become visible. The interval between the operative impression and the visible result is not a period of inactivity. It is the period during which the invisible rearrangement is underway, during which the substance is moving people, events, and conditions into alignment with the form it has been instructed to produce. The man who understands this does not measure the interval and conclude that the law has failed. He reads the converging circumstances as the signature of a process already in motion, maintains his impression with undiminished faith, and continues to act on every opportunity his aligned environment presents, knowing that each action he takes is part of the causal chain whose conclusion the substance is already producing. James Allen, writing in his own era with the severity and precision of a man who had examined the human condition without the cushion of comfortable assumptions, arrives at a conclusion that is structurally identical to Wattles' claim from an entirely different direction of approach. Where Wattles begins with the substance, with the physics of the creative medium that underlies all formed conditions. Alan begins with the man. He begins with the observation that the state of a human life corresponds, without exception and without comfortable deviation, to the state of the dominant thought that inhabits the mind living that life. The outer is the faithful expression of the inner. The condition is the form taken by the character. The circumstance is the materialization of the mind. Alan does not present this as a hopeful metaphor. He presents it as the most observable fact available to any man willing to look at his own life with sufficient honesty to see it clearly. The connection between Alan's observation and Wattles's physics is not metaphorical. It is mechanical. Alan describes the law from the human end of the causal chain. Your dominant thought produces your dominant condition. Wattles describes it from the universal end. The substance of your conditions is responsive to your dominant thought. These are not two different claims. They are two descriptions of the same causal process, observed from opposite vantage points. Alan is standing inside the human experience and observing that thought reliably precedes and shapes condition. Wattles is standing at the level of the physical medium and describing why this reliability has the structure of a law rather than a tendency. Because the medium through which conditions are formed is intrinsically, constitutively responsive to the thought that acts upon it. Together, they close the explanatory loop with a completeness that neither achieves alone. Why does this closure matter? Because each thinker, taken in isolation, faces a specific objection that the other's work dissolves. Alan faces the objection that his observation of correspondence between inner and outer is merely psychological, a form of selective attention or self-fulfilling prophecy, or the natural consequence of behavioral alignment between thought and action. This objection does not require any mechanism beyond the familiar one of human behavior and its social consequences. Wattles faces the objection that his physics of a thinking substance is philosophically interesting but empirically unverifiable. That without a mechanism connecting the thought in the mind to the rearrangement of physical conditions, the claim remains in the domain of assertion rather than science. The Allen-Wattles bridge dissolves both objections simultaneously. Allen's observed law of correspondence has a mechanism. Wattles' responsive substance. Wattles' physics of impression has a human application. Allen's law of inner cause and outer effect. The philosophy confirms the physics. The physics supplies the philosophy with its explanatory foundation. The precision of Allen's teaching, examined through the lens Wattles provides, also acquires a dimension of urgency that it may not fully carry on its own. Allen's central claim, that a man is literally what he thinks, his character being the complete sum of all his thoughts, becomes, in Wattles' framework, a claim about a man's ongoing and continuous instruction to the formless substance. Every thought in the aggregate of a man's character is a standing impression upon the substance from which his conditions are formed. His character is not merely his inner state, it is his operating command, the continuously transmitted instruction to a responsive medium that is executing it at this moment and every moment with perfect fidelity. This means that the project of character formation, which Allen places at the center of all genuine human development, is not merely a moral project. It is a physics project. It is the project of calibrating the operative impression so that the conditions it produces correspond to what the man would choose if he understood that his choice was being executed without delay. Allen's famous insistence that circumstance does not make the man, but reveals him. That the outer condition is not the cause of the inner state. but the product of it. Now carries a physical precision it might otherwise lack. When Allen says the man's circumstances are a mirror of his thought, Wattles tells us what the mirror is made of. The same formless substance that composes the man's body, the man's environment, and the man's every opportunity and obstacle. The mirror is not symbolic, it is physical. The correspondence between inner thought and outer condition is not a poetic truth that occasionally manifests in roughly predictable ways. It is a lawful relationship between a cause and its effect, operating through a medium that has no capacity for independent judgment, no mechanism for deviation, and no interest in the gap between what the man says he wants and what his dominant thought actually instructs. Allen shows the pattern. Wattles reveals the physics. Together, they constitute a complete account of why the human condition is precisely what it is, and precisely what it will become. The implications of this completed account for the practice of personal transformation are both clarifying and demanding. Allen teaches that the only genuine path to change circumstances is changed thought, not adjusted behavior, not altered strategy, not improved tactics applied to an unchanged inner character, but the thorough, deliberate reformation of the dominant thought from which all circumstances ultimately flow. Wattles confirms this from the physics. You cannot change your conditions by working exclusively at the level of conditions, because conditions are the output of a process that begins at the level of thought and operates through the medium of the formless substance. Before arriving at the physical world, to expect changed conditions from unchanged thought is to expect a different output from an unchanged input. And the substance, as Wattles repeatedly affirms, is too precise an instrument to accommodate that expectation. It will produce the result that corresponds to the thought it receives. If the thought has not changed, the result will not change, regardless of the physical effort applied to the existing conditions. This is the point at which the Allen-Wattles synthesis becomes most uncomfortable for the modern mind and most valuable. The modern mind wants to locate the cause of its circumstances in the external world. It wants to identify the market conditions, the social structures, the biographical accidents, the institutional constraints that are preventing the desired outcome from materializing. And it is not wrong that these external factors exist. Allen and Wattles do not deny the reality of the external world. What they deny, with unified and uncompromising precision, is its primacy in the causal chain. The external world is the last link. The thought is the first. Between them operates the formless substance, which has already received its instruction and is already producing the conditions that correspond to it. The external factors that the man identifies as his obstacles are themselves formations of a substance that is responsive to his thought. Which means that the question of whether they are genuinely immovable or merely the current form of a substance awaiting a new impression depends entirely on whether the new impression is being made. Allen's concept of the creative power of vision aligns with Wattles' mechanics of impression in a way that has particular practical importance. Allen describes the man who holds a clear, sustained vision of a better life as genuinely different in kind from the man who merely wishes for improvement. Not psychologically different in the superficial sense of being more optimistic, but causally different in the precise sense of being engaged in an act that operates on the structure of his reality. Wattles provides the physics of this difference. The man with the clear, sustained vision is making a specific, consistent impression on the formless substance, setting the causal chain in motion from its first link. The man who merely wishes is producing a vague, inconsistent, doubt-interrupted signal that the substance cannot execute with precision. Both are impressing the substance. Only one is impressing it with a form the substance can actually build. The practical method that emerges from the Wattles synthesis is therefore not a method of external action, but a method of inner causation. A discipline of thought that precedes conditions and ultimately governs all outer action. Allen calls it the building of character. Wattles calls it the maintenance of the operative impression. They are describing the same practice from different angles. The daily, deliberate, increasingly precise alignment of the dominant inner state with the specific form of life the man intends to produce. This practice is not comfortable in the way that conventional achievement strategies are comfortable, because it places the entire responsibility for the man's conditions squarely and irrevocably on the quality of his own thought. There is no external factor left to blame. There is no institutional obstacle that the formless substance cannot move if the impression commanding it to move is clear and consistent, and held with the certainty of one who understands the law. The discomfort of this is the discomfort of full accountability, which is also, for the man who is willing to receive it, the beginning of full power. The final and most potent dimension of the Wattles link is the one that concerns the nature of the self that makes the impression. Allen's central insight is not merely that thoughts produce conditions, but that the quality of the thoughts that a man habitually generates is a precise reflection of the quality of the character from which they arise. A man of shallow character generates shallow thoughts. Thoughts of competition, of scarcity, of comparison, of the petty grievances that consume the mental space that should be occupied by creative vision. A man of developed character generates thoughts of a different order. Thoughts rooted in principle, in creative purpose, in the abundant and advancing nature of the substance that composes reality. Wattles' physics confirms the stakes. The quality of the character determines the quality of the impression, which determines the quality of the conditions produced. Character is not a moral decoration added to the achievement process. It is the mechanism by which the impression is made, which means it is, in the most precise possible sense, the source of everything. The inner cause, as Allen identifies it, is therefore not merely a thought. It is a state of being, a formed condition of the man's inner nature that generates thoughts of a specific quality as naturally as water generates moisture. Wattles' physics gives this state of being a physical dimension it might otherwise lack. The formed inner condition of the man is itself an impression upon the formless substance, a standing instruction that the substance is executing continuously, not merely in the moments when the man is consciously directing his thought. This means that the man who works only at the level of directed thought, who focuses his mental effort during designated periods of visualization, and then returns to his habitual state for the remainder of his time, is making an operative impression for a fraction of the available time and a habitual counter-impression for the rest. The substance reads the dominant signal, which is the habitual state, not the deliberate peak, and produces conditions that correspond to it. Allen's method of character formation is thus revealed by Wattles' physics to be not merely morally important, but operationally critical. You cannot out-impress your character because your character is the dominant and continuous operator of the mechanism you are trying to use. The bridge between Allen and Wattles is therefore not merely academic. It is strategic. Understanding both ends of the causal chain gives the man who wishes to operate the physics of impression a complete map of the territory he must master. He must work at the level of character, building the inner nature from which operative thoughts naturally arise. And simultaneously at the level of specific mental impression, directing the creative force of the formless substance toward the particular forms he intends to produce. Neither effort is sufficient without the other. Character without directed impression produces a general quality of life that reflects the man's developed nature, but lacks the specific formations he desires. Directed impression without character produces a signal that is overwhelmed by the stronger and more continuous counter-signal of the undeveloped inner state. Together, operating as Allen and Wattles together prescribe, they constitute the complete physics of mind over matter. A physics whose first law is that the world you inhabit is the world your inner nature is commanding the substance of existence to produce. The second strategic connection that Wattles' secret science establishes with precision concerns the domain of effort, specifically, the widespread and deeply embedded belief that sustained physical effort, applied with sufficient discipline to the external world, is the primary and sufficient cause of material achievement. This belief is not merely an opinion. In the modern era, it has the status of a moral axiom, one of the few remaining commitments shared across ideological lines, a conviction so fundamental to the culture of achievement that questioning it feels not merely mistaken, but somehow indecent. The man who suggests that effort alone is insufficient is invariably heard as suggesting that effort is unnecessary, which is a misreading that reveals how thoroughly the conventional framework has conflated the question of whether effort is necessary with the question of whether it is sufficient. Wattles makes a distinction. The conventional framework has no conceptual equipment to receive. Effort is necessary, but not primary. It is the final expression of a causal chain, not the first. What Wattles identifies as the effort fallacy is the specific error of applying force at the level of physical conditions while leaving the level of mental impression unengaged, of attempting to rearrange the visible world while ignoring the invisible medium through which all visible rearrangement ultimately proceeds. The man who commits this error is not lazy. He may be extraordinarily industrious, but his industry is applied to the last link in the causal chain, and every hour he spends working exclusively at that level is an hour in which the formless substance, which has received no operative impression beyond the habitual thought of competitive struggle, is faithfully producing conditions that correspond to the struggle rather than to the abundance he is working toward. He is, in Wattles' precise diagnosis, making the mechanism run against itself. His physical effort pushing toward abundance, while his dominant thought instructs the creative substance to maintain the conditions of scarcity. Allen confirms this diagnosis from the character level, which is to say, from the level of the inner cause that produces both the quality of effort and the quality of its results. Action without inner alignment, in Allen's framework, does not merely fail to produce the desired result. It produces the wrong result reliably. Because the action, however sustained and skilled, is the expression of a character that has not been aligned with the form of life it is attempting to produce. The farmer who plants seeds in poisoned soil is not being rewarded or punished for the quality of his labor. He is receiving the precise consequence of operating in conditions that his inner state has created, and that his continued failure to examine his inner state will continue to create. The soil, in Wattles' physics, is the formless substance. And it is taking its instructions not from the farmer's effort, but from the farmer's dominant thought. The secret science is therefore not, in any sense, anti-effort. It is a precise recontextualization of effort, a repositioning of the act of working in the world from the level of primary cause to the level of necessary expression. Effort remains essential, It is the physical channel through which the formless substance delivers its creative results into the man's concrete circumstances. The substance cannot materialize a new condition without the aligned man's physical action meeting it at the boundary between the invisible and the visible. But the nature of the effort required when the operative impression is correctly maintained is qualitatively different from the nature of the effort required when it is not. The aligned man does not fight his way toward his desired condition. He moves toward it through actions that his aligned environment consistently presents as the natural next step, through opportunities that appear at the moment of readiness, through a pattern of converging circumstances that reduces the friction between intention and result to a fraction of what the unaligned man experiences. This is not because the world is rewarding his virtue. It is because the substance composing his world is obeying his impression, and effort aligned with the substance's own movement requires incomparably less force than effort directed against it. What makes the effort fallacy so durable, so resistant to correction, even in the face of direct evidence that sustained effort alone is insufficient, is its deep compatibility with the competitive mind. The man who believes that effort is the primary cause naturally believes that more effort in competition with others' effort is the path to more result. He works harder, more strategically, more single-mindedly, and when the results remain elusive, he concludes that he has not yet worked hard enough or skillfully enough, or against the right competitors. The possibility that the variable he is failing to address is not the quantity of his effort, but the quality of his inner impression never enters the framework, because the framework has no place for it. Wattles does not describe this as a minor strategic error. He describes it as a fundamental confusion about the structure of causality, a confusion that traps the man in an indefinitely extending cycle of more effort producing diminishing returns, because the level at which the cause of his results actually operates remains completely untouched. The precision of Wattles's correction of the effort fallacy becomes most visible when examined against the specific claim he makes about what the properly aligned man finds different about his relationship to work. The man who has established the operative impression upon the formless substance and maintains it with consistency does not find that work disappears from his life. He finds that the work he is called to do is the right work, the action that corresponds to the moment in the causal sequence where the substance needs a physical agent to move. His effort is, in this sense, perfectly efficient. It is applied exactly where the process requires application, at the moment when application is most productive, in the direction that the substance's own movement is already carrying him. This is not less effort. It may, in terms of hours and intensity, be more, but it is effort that builds rather than effort that maintains. Effort that advances the causal chain rather than effort that merely sustains the man's position in a competition whose terms are themselves the product of an unexamined and operative impression of scarcity. The relationship between effort and the operative impression also illuminates one of the most commonly misunderstood aspects of Wattles's science: the role of timing. The man who has made a clear impression on the formless substance and is maintaining it faithfully must still act. But he must act on what his present environment presents to him, not on what a predetermined schedule demands of him. This is a form of effort that the competitive mind finds deeply uncomfortable, because the competitive mind operates on a timeline of urgency, of ground that must be taken before competitors take it, of opportunities that will close if not seized immediately, of a race whose pace is set by external pressures rather than internal principle. Wattles's science operates on a different temporality entirely, the temporality of a process that is already in motion at the level of the substance, moving toward the form already impressed. requiring only that the man remain aligned, remain grateful, and act with his full capacity on each successive opportunity, as it is presented by an environment that the substance is already arranging in his favor. Allen's teaching on this point is equally precise and equally demanding. He identifies the specific failure that most people confuse with lack of effort: the failure of sustained inner work. Most men, Allen observes, are willing to work hard in the visible world and completely unwilling to work hard in the invisible one, to apply to the reformation of their inner thought the same sustained, disciplined, daily effort they apply to their external activities. This disproportion is the source of the pattern they experience as injustice. Visible effort producing invisible results. Labor producing exhaustion without corresponding advance. The secret science reveals that the disproportion is not injustice, but precision. The formless substance is responding with its characteristic fidelity to the dominant impression, which is the impression made by the untouched, unreformed, habitual inner state. The visible effort is producing surface disturbances in conditions that the invisible substance is simultaneously maintaining in their existing form. The correction is not more visible effort. It is the application of equal or greater effort to the inner work that determines the quality of the impression, which is the effort that actually commands the substance. The synthesis of Wattles' physics and Allen's inner cause produces, on the question of effort, a position that has no equivalent in the conventional literature of achievement. It is not the position that effort is everything, nor the position that mindset is everything. It is the position that effort and inner impression are two phases of a single causal process, and that the man who engages both phases in their correct relationship and correct sequence finds that his effort is multiplied by a force incomparably larger than his own. This is Wattles' own formulation, and it is worth holding with full attention. The effort of the aligned man is multiplied by the cooperative movement of the formless substance, which is itself an inexhaustible creative power operating throughout every particle of the formed world. The man who understands this does not pit his individual force against the resistance of the physical world. He aligns his individual force with the creative force of the substance that composes the world, and finds that what appeared as resistance was always, in reality, the reflection of a prior instruction that he now has the knowledge to change. The final dimension of this eradication of the effort fallacy concerns what Wattles calls the creative plane versus the competitive plane, a distinction that is not merely strategic, but metaphysical. The competitive plane is the plane on which the man who does not understand the physics operates. The plane of fixed, finite supply that must be divided among competing claimants, where every gain comes at another's cost and every advance requires overcoming another's resistance. The creative plane is the plane on which the man who understands the physics operates, the plane on which the formless substance is continuously creating new form from its inexhaustible reservoir of creative potential, where the man who impresses a specific form upon the substance is not taking that form from anyone else, but calling it into existence from the medium that has unlimited capacity to produce it. Moving from the competitive plane to the creative plane is not a metaphor for changing one's attitude. It is a literal description of a shift in the level of causality at which a man operates. From the level of effects, where competition over fixed resources is a genuine and pressing reality, to the level of causes, where the substance that produces all resources is available to every mind that impresses it with a clear, faith-maintained, advancing intention. At the level of causes, there are no competitors. There is only the substance, the impression, and the form it is already producing. The formless substance does not respond to aspiration. It responds to instruction. And the quality of the instruction determines the quality of the result, with a precision that admits of no approximation. Wattles is explicit and uncompromising on this point. The conditions under which the substance obeys a specific mind are not vague. They are not subject to personal interpretation or individual adjustment. They are the operating specifications of the most sensitive and most powerful instrument available to a human being. And the man who operates this instrument without knowing its specifications is not a mystic failing to achieve the miraculous. He is an engineer attempting to run a precision machine without reading the manual and wondering why the output is incorrect. The first specification is the present tense of the vision. The formless substance responds to what is impressed upon it as current reality. This is not a psychological trick of visualization designed to produce confidence. It is a structural requirement of the impression mechanism. The substance does not operate in the future tense. It has no relationship to tomorrow or next year. It reads the dominant impression as a description of what is, and moves toward producing the form that description specifies. The man who holds his desired reality as a future projection, as something he hopes to achieve, as something that will exist when conditions change, is impressing the substance with the thought of wanting rather than the thought of having. The substance, obedient to the law, produces the conditions of wanting, the unending sense of not yet having arrived. With the same precision, it would apply to any other instruction. The shift from future tense aspiration to present tense impression is not a semantic adjustment. It is the difference between a command and a wish, and only commands operate the physics. The second specification is the consistency of the impression across the full span of the man's mental life, not across the span of his deliberate meditation or his designated periods of visualization, across the full span of his waking thought. The substance reads the dominant signal, the thought that persists across the greatest range of time and mental states, not the peak signal that is highest at specific moments and absent or reversed in between. This means that the man whose operative impression is vivid and precise for 30 minutes each morning, but who spends the remainder of his waking hours in the habitual thought of competitive anxiety, is not making a 30-minute daily impression on the formless substance. He is making a 30-minute impression followed by many hours of counter-impression. And the substance is reading the dominant signal, which is the counter-impression, and producing conditions accordingly. Consistency does not mean constant conscious effort. It means the establishment of the operative impression so thoroughly in the man's mental posture that it becomes the background state, the default orientation of his mind, rather than a peak he returns to once a day. The third specification is the genuine quality of gratitude. Wattles' insistence on gratitude is not a pastoral instruction to count one's blessings. It is a technical requirement of the impression mechanism. Gratitude, in the specific sense Wattles intends, is the lived recognition that the substance is already responding, that the process is already in motion, that the invisible rearrangement has already begun, that the form impressed upon the substance is already being produced at the level of the substance, even before it becomes visible at the level of physical conditions. This recognition does what nothing else can do. It keeps the channel between the mind and the substance clear of the obstruction that doubt and impatience create. Doubt, in Wattles' physics, is not merely a negative emotional state. It is a counter-instruction. a signal to the substance that the impression may not be valid, that the process may not be operating, that the result may not come. Gratitude is the specific mental posture that dissolves doubt. Not by denying the absence of the visible result, but by accurately locating the result in the phase of the process it actually occupies. The invisible phase, already underway, already progressing toward the visible phase that is its inevitable continuation. The fourth specification is the action taken on the present environment. And this specification is the one most frequently misunderstood by students who interpret the science as a passive practice. The formless substance does not move the physical world without a physical agent. It moves the physical world through the aligned man's actions. The aligned man must therefore be in active engagement with his present environment, performing with full capacity and full presence the actions that his current situation calls for, not waiting for the grand opportunity that the substance will eventually create, but working with complete mastery on the lesser but immediate opportunities that his environment currently presents. This is not a concession to practicality, it is a specification of the mechanism. The substance moves the physical world by presenting the aligned man with successively richer opportunities, each of which requires his full engagement to produce the next. The man who waits passively for the culminating opportunity while declining the intermediate ones is interrupting the chain through which the substance delivers its creative product. The action must be continuous, fully rendered, and completely present. Because the substance requires an agent who is moving in the world in order to move the world toward the form it has been instructed to produce. These four specifications together, present tense vision, consistent impression, genuine gratitude, and aligned action, constitute what Wattles means when he says a man may take command of the formless substance and cause it to produce whatever form he clearly and faithfully impresses upon it. None of the four can be omitted. Each functions as a necessary condition of the mechanism, a condition whose absence does not merely reduce the efficiency of the process, but changes the nature of the instruction the substance receives. The man who has three of the four is not operating the mechanism at 75% capacity. He is operating a different mechanism, one whose output corresponds to the actual impression made by the three-condition signal, which is a different impression from the one the man believes he is making. This is the source of the experience that the law works inconsistently or only for some people, an experience that is itself the most precise possible evidence of the law's operation. The inconsistency in the results reflects the inconsistency in the conditions. The precision of the law never varies. Only the precision of the application does. What does it mean in daily practice? To hold the vision in the present tense while the physical conditions it describes have not yet materialized. This is the question that tests the man's genuine understanding of the physics, because it requires him to maintain a specific and demanding inner posture in the face of a physical reality that appears to contradict it. The man who has not truly understood the physics will read the current physical conditions as evidence about whether the law is working. The man who has understood it will read them as information about what phase of the process he is in, understanding that the absence of the visible form does not indicate the absence of the invisible process, but merely the temporal gap between the impression and its physical expression. This is not self-deception. It is accurate reading of the causal sequence. The visible result has not arrived because the invisible rearrangement has not yet completed, not because the impression was not received. To treat the current conditions as evidence of failure is to confuse the gap between cause and effect with the absence of the causal relationship, which is a logical error that happens to have a devastating practical consequence. It introduces doubt, which is the one counter-impression powerful enough to interrupt the mechanism at its most critical phase. The specific way in which most people fail to maintain consistent impression is not through dramatic philosophical doubt. It is through the mundane, constant, largely unconscious reversion to what Wattles calls the competitive mind. The habitual background state of a man who has not yet established the operative impression as his dominant posture. The competitive mind does not announce itself. It does not arrive in bold declarations of scarcity or fear. It infiltrates the mental field through ordinary, culturally normalized channels. Reading the news with an anxious attunement to threat. Comparing one's circumstances to those of others with an involuntary calculus of relative standing. Responding to minor setbacks with a disproportionate sense of lost ground. Each of these reactions, individually, seems inconsequential, but each is a moment in which the dominant thought is the thought of competitive scarcity. And the formless substance, reading that signal with its characteristic fidelity, is impressing it back into the physical conditions with equal precision. The accumulation of these ordinary, unconscious reversions is what produces the experience of persistent conditions. The sense that nothing is really changing despite genuine effort and occasional clarity of intention. The discipline required to maintain the operative impression under the continuous pressure of the competitive culture is therefore not the dramatic discipline of heroic resistance. It is the quieter and more demanding discipline of sustained vigilance. The moment-by-moment practice of catching the reversion as it begins and returning the dominant thought to the operative impression before the counter-signal has time to accumulate. This practice has no shortcut and no external validator. The man knows whether he is maintaining the impression by reading the quality of his own dominant mental state. Not by inspecting his feelings for positivity, but by examining whether his deepest, most persistent, most automatic thought is the thought of the form already being produced or the thought of the form not yet possessed. These are two distinct mental postures with two distinct and opposite relationships to the formless substance. And the substance will obey whichever one is dominant with the same complete fidelity it gives to every instruction it receives. Gratitude, understood as a technical requirement rather than a devotional practice, also has a specific relationship to action that Wattles identifies and that most students miss. The man who is genuinely grateful, who genuinely recognizes that the process is already in motion, is the man who acts from a position of creative advance rather than defensive compensation. His action is not the action of a man trying to produce an outcome he fears may not materialize. It is the action of a man moving forward in a process he knows to be underway, cooperating with a movement already in progress rather than initiating a movement against unknown resistance. This difference in the quality of action is not merely psychological. It changes the nature of the physical signal the man sends into his environment. The quality of the decision he makes, the clarity of the communication he offers, the caliber of the work he produces. And it is these physical signals that the substance uses, in part, to rearrange the human and material elements of the man's environment into the configuration the operative impression has described. Gratitude, therefore, is not a warmth of spirit that one adds to the mechanism as an enhancement. It is the specific mental posture that allows the mechanism to run at full power. The question of what constitutes a specific enough vision, specific enough to function as an operative impression rather than a directional preference, is one that Wattles addresses with a precision that is both practical and philosophically exact. The standard he sets is not merely visual detail. It is the standard of genuine conceptual clarity. The man must be able to say, with precision and without qualification, what form he is instructing the substance to produce. This means he must know not merely the category of the desired outcome, but its particular character, not merely that he wants wealth, but what form of wealth, engaged in what kind of activity, producing what quality of contribution to the advancing life of the people it serves. The substance can only produce what is impressed upon it as a specific form. A formless desire, a directional inclination toward more or better or different, does not constitute an operative impression because it does not constitute a form. The substance cannot build a form from the impression of formlessness. It requires a specific image, held with specific faith, to execute a specific creative act. The operating specifications of the formless substance, taken together, constitute a description of the kind of mind that can actually command matter. The kind of mind that has the clarity, the consistency, the genuine acknowledgement of the substance's responsiveness, and the active physical engagement with the present environment that the mechanism requires. What becomes clear when these specifications are enumerated in full is that this is not the mind of the dreamer. It is the mind of the master, the man who has understood the physics with sufficient depth to engage it with the precision it demands, who has done the inner work of establishing the operative impression as his dominant posture, and who acts in his physical world with the full capacity of a man who knows that his action is the terminal expression of a causal chain that began in the invisible and is already completed there before it becomes visible here. This is the mind that matter obeys, not because the universe has made an exception for this particular man, but because this man has, finally and exactly, learned to speak the language the universe has always been listening for. The specific mechanism by which most people interrupt the physics of impression is not philosophical doubt, though doubt is its expression. It is not laziness, though disengagement from the practice is its symptom. It is what Wattles identifies with clinical precision as the return to the competitive mind, a reversion so deep and so habitual that most people do not recognize it as a choice. They experience it as reality, as the accurate perception of a world that is genuinely finite, genuinely threatening, and genuinely indifferent to their intentions. The competitive mind is not a temporary psychological state. It is a worldview, a complete framework for interpreting experience. And it is the default worldview of a civilization that has organized its institutions, its educational systems, and its most fundamental assumptions about human motivation around the premise that the supply of good is fixed, and the struggle for its distribution is the primary fact of human life. Wattles does not treat this worldview with sympathy. He treats it as the diagnosis of a specific error in the understanding of the nature of the substance from which reality is made. Every moment a man spends in competitive anxiety is a moment in which his dominant thought is the thought of a man in scarcity. A man for whom the supply of what he needs is limited, for whom another's success represents a diminishment of his own prospects, for whom the monitoring of rivals and the calculation of relative position are not merely practical necessities, but the central organizing activities of his mental life. This is not merely an unpleasant way to think. In Wattles' physics, it is a specific and precise instruction to the formless substance. An instruction to produce conditions that correspond to the reality the competitive mind is perceiving. The substance does not evaluate this instruction. It does not distinguish between the man who holds it deliberately and the man who holds it by default. It obeys it with the same perfect fidelity it gives to every instruction, and it produces scarcity with the same creative precision with which it would produce abundance if it had been given the corresponding impression instead. What makes the competitive mind particularly destructive as an operating state is its self-validating structure. The man who operates from the competitive mind produces conditions of scarcity, competition, and resistance, because these are the conditions corresponding to the impression the substance has received. He then reads these conditions as evidence that the world is genuinely scarce, genuinely competitive, and genuinely resistant, which reinforces the competitive mind, deepens the impression, and produces more precisely the conditions he is now even more firmly convinced are the natural and unalterable state of reality. This is not a vicious cycle in the metaphorical sense. It is a closed causal loop, a feedback system in which the output continuously reinforces the input that produced it. Breaking the loop requires not merely a change in thought, but a change in the understanding of what thought is doing. A recognition that the conditions being read as external evidence are themselves the product of the internal signal being sent, and that the evidence will change when, and only when, the signal changes. The return to the competitive mind typically occurs at the moment of maximum practical pressure, the moment when the physical conditions appear most resistant and most urgent, the moment when the gap between the man's current circumstances and his operative impression seems widest, the moment when the demand for immediate material result is most insistent. This is the moment Wattles identifies as the decisive test of the man's understanding of the physics, because it is precisely this moment at which the operative impression most requires steadfast maintenance, and precisely this moment at which the competitive mind exerts its maximum gravitational pull. The man who does not understand the physics reads this moment as evidence that the process has failed, reverts to competitive anxiety, and interrupts the mechanism at its most advanced phase. The man who understands the physics reads this moment as the phase of maximum distance between the cause and its physical expression, which is not a reason to doubt the process, but a reason to hold the impression with greater precision and greater faith, knowing that the visible result is approaching as necessarily as the physical expression of any other cause approaches its effect. The formless substance, it must be understood, does not punish the return to the competitive mind. It does not register the failure, withdraw its responsiveness as a consequence, or make the operative impression harder to establish on the next occasion. The law is impersonal in the fullest sense of that word. It responds to what is impressed upon it with no memory of previous impressions and no adjustment for previous failures. Each moment is the first moment. Each impression is received and executed with the same fidelity as every other impression the substance has ever received. The man who has spent years impressing the substance with the competitive thought of scarcity can, in this moment, make the precise, clear, faith-maintained impression of the desired form. And the substance will respond to it with the same creative precision it would have given if the man had been impressing it correctly since birth. There is no accumulated debt to the substance. There is only the impression being made right now, and the form it is already beginning to produce. This understanding of the substance's impersonal and non-historical responsiveness is one of the most practically important aspects of Wattles' science, and one of the most therapeutically precise. Though Wattles uses no therapeutic language, it means that the man whose past is entirely composed of competitive thinking, scarcity conditions, and failed applications of principles he only half understood is not at a disadvantage relative to the man who has never known these conditions. The substance does not read the man's history. It reads his current dominant impression. The past is a formation of the substance that has already been produced. It has no claim on what the substance produces next. The man who grasps this, who genuinely understands that his history is not a constraint on his future, but merely a record of the impressions he was making before he knew the physics, has in that moment removed one of the most significant obstructions between his mind and the substance's creative response, the deeply embedded belief that what has been is evidence of what must continue to be. The competitive mind also introduces a specific distortion into the man's relationship to other people, a distortion with direct physical consequences in Wattles' framework. The man in the competitive mind perceives other people primarily as competitors for the fixed supply of good, as entities whose success diminishes his own prospects, whose advancement requires his retreat, whose achievements are meaningful primarily as data points in a zero-sum calculation. He is always running in the background of his awareness. This perception is not merely philosophically incorrect in Wattles' account. It is operationally destructive because it transforms every human relationship in the man's environment into a source of competitive anxiety, which means the substance, reading this dominant signal, is organizing his environment around competition. The people who appear in his life appear in the role of competitors, not because they are by nature more competitive than anyone else, but because the man's operative impression has assigned them that role in the reality it is instructing the substance to produce. The correction Wattles prescribes is the shift from the competitive to the creative, the deliberate reorientation of the dominant thought from the thought of taking from a limited supply to the thought of producing from an unlimited one. This shift changes the man's relationship to other people at a fundamental level. Where the competitive mind sees rivals, the creative mind sees potential collaborators in the advancement of life that the substance is continuously producing. This is not naive idealism. It is the recognition of an accurate fact about the nature of the substance, that its supply is unlimited, that another man's creative success is not a deduction from the man's own available good, and that the human relationships in his environment are among the primary channels through which the substance delivers its creative products into the physical world. The man who holds others in his impression as contributors to an advancing and abundant reality, rather than as competitors in a diminishing one, is impressing the substance with a signal that produces a fundamentally different class of human relationships, ones characterized by mutual advance rather than mutual threat. The question that arises at this point is one that the honest student of Wattles' science must confront directly. Is it possible to maintain the creative impression under the continuous and structural pressure of a civilization organized around competitive assumptions? The answer Wattles gives is unambiguous. It is not only possible, it is the specific project of the man who has understood the physics. The competitive assumptions of the surrounding civilization are not constraints on what the formless substance will produce. They are simply the dominant impression of a large number of minds, a collective signal that the substance is executing faithfully, producing collective conditions of competition and scarcity that confirm the assumption for the people whose minds are making the signal. The individual who breaks from this collective signal does not thereby break from the substance. He accesses the same substance, the same inexhaustible creative medium, with a different and clearer instruction. The substance makes no distinction between the collective impression and the individual one. It responds to both with perfect fidelity. The individual who understands the physics and applies it with precision does not need the civilization to change its mind. He simply needs to change his own. The fatal interruption of the signal, taken in its full dimensions, is therefore not a single dramatic failure, but an accumulation of small, ordinary, largely unconscious reversions, each individually negligible, but collectively constituting the dominant counter-signal that overrides the operative impression. The discipline that Wattles' science demands is not the discipline of heroic mental effort. It is the discipline of sustained attention, the practice of knowing where the dominant signal is pointing, catching every reversion to the competitive mode the moment it begins, and returning the impression to its operative form without self-criticism, without dramatizing the failure, and without the anxious effort that would itself constitute a form of competitive thinking. The return to the operative impression must be as clean and as unemotional as the navigator's return to his calculated heading after a momentary deviation. Quiet, precise, and informed by the understanding that the course was always known and the destination was never in doubt. The man who has understood the architecture of the formless substance and the specifications of the operative impression faces, at the level of daily practice, a challenge that is not intellectual. The physics are clear. The logic is unshakable. The failure point is not comprehension. It is maintenance. The operative impression is not a state that, once established, sustains itself without effort. It is a living condition of the mind, one that requires the same daily calibration and deliberate renewal that any precise instrument requires to maintain its accuracy over time. Wattles describes this daily practice with a specificity that distinguishes his science from the vague spiritual counsel that promises transformation through occasional contemplation. The man who operates the physics with the precision it demands begins each day by performing a specific act of mental recalibration, an act that is not performed for emotional effect, but for operational necessity. The morning calibration Wattles describes is the deliberate return to the clear, specific, faith-held image of the desired form, not as a reminder of something the man wants, but as the conscious re-establishment of the dominant impression on the formless substance. This distinction is critical. The man who begins his day by thinking about what he wants is in the future tense posture of aspiration. The man who begins his day by impressing the substance with the present tense form of the desired reality is operating the mechanism. The practical difference between these two orientations is the practical difference between a man who is wishing for a result and a man who is commanding a responsive medium to produce one. Both men may perform the same external action. Both may sit in quiet contemplation of their intended outcome. But the operative quality of what they are doing is categorically different, and the formless substance reads that difference with unfailing precision. The daily practice of maintaining the operative impression also requires the specific discipline of catching and correcting the competitive thought. Not with the forced positivity of a man who is suppressing an authentic response to his circumstances, but with the accurate correction of a man who recognizes a counterproductive signal and replaces it with a more accurate one. Wattles makes a crucial distinction here that must not be passed over. The replacement thought is not an affirmation designed to feel better about conditions that appear adverse. It is the accurate thought, the thought that corresponds to what is actually true about the nature of the substance and the nature of the supply. When a man catches himself thinking that the supply is limited, the accurate correction is not a forced declaration that abundance is his birthright. It is the recognition, grounded in the physics, that the substance from which all supply is formed is inexhaustible, that the scarcity appearing in his conditions is the faithful product of a prior scarcity impression, not an objective report on the nature of reality. The accurate thought dissolves the counter-impression not through emotional override, but through intellectual precision. Evening practice, in Wattles' daily discipline, takes the form of genuine gratitude for the evidence, however small, however indirect, that the substance has been moving in response to the operative impression. This is not the performance of thankfulness for things already possessed. It is the recognition of process, the acknowledgement of the convergences, the unexpected openings, the right people appearing through unplanned channels, the information arriving at the precise moment it is needed. Each of these occurrences being, in Wattles' physics, the physical trace of the substance in active, responsive motion. The man who ends his day by identifying this evidence is not engaging in wishful thinking. He is reading the causal record accurately, observing the physical signatures of a process that the materialist framework would classify as coincidence, and that the secret science classifies as confirmation. The confirmation, held in genuine gratitude, strengthens the impression for the following day, which increases the clarity and consistency of the signal the substance receives, which accelerates the convergence of the physical conditions toward the form already impressed. The discipline of daily calibration also requires a specific relationship to setbacks, a relationship that is neither the emotional suppression of disappointment nor the competitive mind's reflexive conclusion that the process has failed. Wattles' physics offers a third response, which is the diagnostic one. The setback is not evidence of the law's failure, but information about the quality of the impression. If a convergence that appeared to be moving toward the desired form has dispersed, the man who understands the physics does not experience this as the universe withdrawing its favor. He experiences it as a signal that the impression was interrupted, that at some point in the interval, the dominant thought shifted from the operative impression to the counter signal, and the substance, reading the changed instruction, began moving in the changed direction. The appropriate response is not grief, but recalibration. Return to the specific, present tense, faith-maintained image. Examine where the competitive mind re-entered the signal, and re-establish the operative impression with greater precision and greater discipline than before. The setback, correctly read, is not an obstacle to the process. It is data that makes the next application of the process more exact. One of the most demanding aspects of the daily discipline of thought maintenance is the management of what Wattles calls the intellectual atmosphere, the mental content that surrounds and shapes the quality of the dominant thought without being directly chosen. This includes what a man reads, what conversations he keeps, what collective mental environments he inhabits, and what cultural narratives he allows to constitute the background of his daily mental life. A man who is making every effort to maintain the operative impression of abundance and advancing life, while daily immersing himself in the cultural narrative of scarcity, threat, and competition, is not merely making his practice harder. He is continuously reintroducing the competitive countersignal into his mental field through channels he has not chosen to regard as significant. The substance reads every signal, not only the ones the man consciously intends, but all the ones he receives and allows to settle into the background of his dominant thought. Managing the intellectual atmosphere is not a peripheral aspect of the daily discipline. It is, in terms of its effect on the operative impression, one of the most consequential. The practical implication of this for the daily structure of a man's life is more radical than most students of Wattles' science initially appreciate. It suggests that the quality of the environments he voluntarily inhabits, the ideas he regularly engages with, the voices he consistently listens to, the mental company he keeps, is not merely a matter of personal preference. It is a matter of operative physics. The environment shapes the background signal shapes the dominant impression, and the dominant impression determines what the formless substance is continuously instructed to produce. The man who takes the secret science seriously cannot take his intellectual environment casually. Every element of his regular mental diet is either supporting the operative impression or degrading it. And the substance does not weight the two differently. It reads the aggregate, and it produces conditions that correspond to what the aggregate instructs. Action, in Wattles' daily discipline, is not reserved for the moments when the man's circumstances obviously call for it. It is a continuous engagement with the present environment, a posture of active readiness that recognizes every current situation as an opportunity to move through the causal sequence toward the next stage of the process. The man who is waiting for the right moment, or the right opportunity, or the right level of certainty before he acts, is misunderstanding the relationship between action and the substance's delivery mechanism. The substance does not create a single moment of grand opportunity and wait for the man to arrive. It creates a continuous sequence of progressively enriching circumstances, each requiring the man's full engagement to serve as the physical link through which the next stage of the process can be delivered. The daily discipline of taking full, present, capacious action on whatever the current environment presents. Not the action of impatience, but the action of a man fully occupied in moving forward from where he is the physical complement of the mental discipline of maintaining the operative impression. Together, they constitute the complete daily practice of the man who has understood the physics and is operating it with the precision it deserves. The consistency that Wattles demands of the daily practice is not the consistency of repetitive routine, but the consistency of living principle. The difference between a man who performs the same actions each day out of habit and a man whose every action, however varied, is governed by the same underlying understanding. The former is practicing a technique. The latter is living a physics. The technique can be interrupted by circumstance, forgotten under pressure, or abandoned when results are slow. The living physics cannot be interrupted, because the man who lives it has understood it deeply enough that returning to the competitive mind, even under maximum pressure, is not a relief, but a recognized regression. A departure from an understanding he cannot unlearn, a step backward from a position whose correctness he can no longer genuinely doubt. This depth of understanding, the point at which the physics is not believed but known, not applied but lived, is the point at which the daily discipline ceases to be a discipline and becomes simply the natural expression of what the man has become. The question Wattles implicitly poses with his description of the daily practice is not whether it is possible to maintain the operative impression with this level of consistency. It is whether the man reading his science is willing to apply it with this level of exactness. The physics does not demand willingness, it simply operates. For the man who meets its specifications and for the man who does not, with equal and absolute fidelity in both directions. The demand is therefore not a demand of the physics. It is a demand the man places on himself when he finally understands what the physics is doing with every thought he allows to become his dominant signal. At that moment, the question of whether the daily discipline is worth maintaining is no longer a question about motivation. It is a question about whether the man has understood what he is choosing between. And there is only one answer available to a man who has actually understood it. The completeness of Wattles' daily practice rests on one final element that integrates all the others. The understanding that the practice is not a means to an end, but the end itself in its process form. The man who maintains the operative impression, catches the competitive reversion, acts on his present environment with full capacity, and ends each day in genuine recognition of the substance's ongoing response, is not a man waiting to arrive. He is a man who has arrived at the operating posture of a mind that commands matter, and who, from that posture, produces the specific forms he intends as naturally and as continuously as a well-calibrated instrument produces its correct output. The daily discipline is not preparation for the use of the physics. It is the use of the physics. Every day of its complete and exact application is a day in which the substance is being correctly instructed. And the substance, faithful to the law that has governed it since before the first star was formed from its creative potential, is producing exactly what it has been told to produce. Wattles describes the evidence that the formless substance is actively responding to an operative impression. And it is not the dramatic, instantaneous materialization that students who have misunderstood the timeline of the physics expect to find. It is a specific, recognizable, repeatable pattern of converging circumstances that, once understood as the signature of the substance in active response, becomes the most legible text available to the man who knows how to read it. The pattern has a specific character. It does not arrive as a single grand event that resolves the entire process in one visible stroke. It arrives as a progressive narrowing of the gap between the man's current conditions and the form impressed upon the substance. A series of increasingly specific, increasingly proximate convergences that trace the path of an invisible process moving steadily toward its physical expression. The first form this evidence takes is the appearance of the right person through an unexpected channel. The man who has made and is maintaining the operative impression finds, with a regularity that exceeds coincidence under any honest accounting, that the people who appear in his environment begin to include those who carry precisely the knowledge, the resource, the connection, or the capacity that his advancing intention requires. This is not a metaphysical claim about the nature of human relationships. It is the physical consequence of the substance rearranging the social environment of the aligned man in response to his impression. The substance operates through people as readily as it operates through any other formed element of the physical world. Because people, like everything else, are formations of the responsive medium, subject to the same causal principles that govern every other element of the man's conditions. The unexpected person who appears at the right moment is not a coincidence. He is the substance delivering a component of the physical form it is building. The second form of physical evidence is the right information arriving through an unplanned encounter. The book encountered by chance, the conversation that opens unexpectedly, the idea that arrives in the gap between one activity and the next. These occurrences, which the materialist framework must attribute to random variation in the flow of experience, represent in Wattles's physics the substance's movement of specific information through the man's environment toward his awareness. The information is not created by the encounter. It existed already in the formed world. What the substance has done is move the man and the information into proximity at the moment when the man's advancing process has created a need for that information. This is the mechanism behind what is commonly observed as the experience of reading a book at the right moment. The sense that its contents speak directly to the man's current condition with a precision that could not have been planned. It was not planned in the conventional sense. It was produced by the substance executing its instruction to advance the man's conditions toward the form impressed upon it. The third form of evidence is the right opportunity materializing at the precise moment of the man's readiness. The convergence of external opening and internal preparation that the man who does not understand the physics attributes to timing, and the man who does attributes to law. Wattles's account of this convergence is precise. The substance does not create the opportunity independently of the man's preparation. nor does it wait for preparation that never comes. It creates conditions that allow the opportunity to materialize when the man's capacity to engage it is sufficient to allow the next stage of the process to advance. This means that the man's action on his present environment, his continuous, full capacity engagement with his current circumstances, is not merely practical activity filling the interval between impressions. It is the development of the readiness that allows the substance to deliver the next level of its creative product. The opportunity and the preparation arrive together precisely because the substance is coordinating, both as components of the same advancing process. These three forms of physical evidence, the right person, the right information, the right opportunity, are not remarkable in the sense of being supernatural. They are remarkable in the sense of being lawful. Their appearance is not random, but patterned. Not occasional, but consistent. Not independent of the quality of the operative impression, but directly responsive to it. The man who maintains the impression with greater precision finds the convergences arriving with greater frequency and greater specificity. The man whose impression is interrupted by the return of the competitive mind finds the convergences dispersing. The right person failing to appear, or appearing and departing before the connection is made. The right information failing to arrive, or arriving and not being recognized. The substance has not changed. The signal has changed. And the evidence, read correctly, tells the man exactly what signal he is sending. Not what he believes he is sending, but what the substance is actually receiving and executing. The man who understands the physics of evidence does not evaluate his progress by the calendar or by comparison with where others are in their visible circumstances. He evaluates it by reading the quality of the convergences his environment is producing, asking not whether the final form has materialized, but whether the pattern of convergence is becoming more specific, more proximate, more clearly aligned with the form he has impressed. A pattern of increasingly specific convergences is the precise evidence of a substance in active, advancing response. A substance that has received a clear instruction and is moving the physical world toward the corresponding form. With the precision of a creative intelligence executing a detailed plan, this is the only evidence the man who understands the physics needs. And it is, for the man who knows how to read it, the most reliable and the most motivating evidence available, because it is not the evidence of a hoped-for future, but the evidence of a present process whose conclusion is as certain as the conclusion of any other causal sequence operating under the governance of natural law. The man who has understood both the theoretical architecture and the physical evidence of Wattles' secret science arrives at a position that has no precise equivalent in the conventional framework of achievement. He is neither the optimist who believes that effort will eventually prevail, nor the mystic who waits for a grace that may or may not arrive, nor the fatalist who has concluded that conditions are beyond his influence. He is the operator, the man who knows the law, has mastered its specifications, reads its physical evidence with accuracy, and proceeds with the settled confidence of a man who is not hoping to influence the physical world, but who knows, with the precision of direct understanding, that he already is, and has been, and will continue to be, for as long as he maintains the quality of the impression that the substance of the physical world has always been, and will always be, faithfully obeying. The physical world is not the indifferent mechanical system that 3 centuries of materialist philosophy have trained the modern mind to assume. It is, at its most fundamental level, the continuous creative output of an intelligent, responsive substance. A substance that has been obeying the dominant thoughts of every human mind since the beginning of time. Without exception, without preference, without editorial comment on the quality or the worthiness of the instruction it receives. This is not a statement requiring faith. It is the conclusion that emerges, with logical necessity, from the architecture Wattles described, the mechanism Allen confirmed, and the pattern of evidence that any man who applies the law with precision will find in the converging circumstances of his own experience. The synthesis of these teachings does not produce a philosophy. It produces a physics, a complete and operative account of the causal relationship between the human mind and the substance of the world it inhabits. The man who reaches this synthesis does not hope his mind can influence matter. He knows it already does, and has always done so, from the first moment he was capable of producing a dominant thought. Whether or not that thought was consciously chosen, the conditions of his life have been, in this precise and lawful sense, the continuous product of his mental impression upon the formless substance, the faithful execution, by a creative medium of inexhaustible capacity, of the instruction provided by his most consistent, most deeply held, most automatically arising state of mind. The history of his conditions is the history of his impressions. The present of his conditions is the present of his impressions, and the future of his conditions is being determined at this moment by the quality of the impression he is making right now. Not by circumstance, not by competition, not by forces external to the causal chain that begins and ends in his own mind. What this synthesis demands, in practical terms, is the shift from the passive relationship to the mind that characterizes the uninstructed life. The life in which the dominant thought is produced by circumstance, habit, and cultural inheritance without deliberate selection, to the active relationship to the mind that characterizes the life of a man who has understood the physics. The active relationship is not more intense. It is more precise. It is the relationship of an operator to an instrument he has understood, has calibrated, and is now using with the full knowledge of what it does and how it does it. The instrument is the mind. The substance it operates upon is the medium of all physical reality. The output is the man's conditions, all of them, in their entirety, without exception. The shift from passive to active relationship to this instrument is not a motivational aspiration. It is a logical consequence of understanding the physics. Once a man has genuinely understood what his mind is doing to the substance of his world at every moment, the decision to let it operate without deliberate direction is no longer a neutral choice. It is a choice to continue impressing the substance with a signal he did not select, and to accept, without the option of complaint, the conditions that signal produces. The synthesis also resolves the apparent tension between the inner discipline Wattles and Allen demand and the outer engagement with a world that practical life requires. They are not in tension. They are two phases of the same causal process: the inner discipline, the maintenance of the operative impression, the daily calibration of the dominant thought, the sustained and genuine acknowledgement of the substance's responsiveness, is the first phase, the phase in which the cause is established and maintained. The outer engagement, the full capacity action on the present environment, the development of readiness, the cooperative movement with the opportunities the substance presents, is the second phase, the phase in which the cause is expressed through a physical agent and the product is delivered into the visible world. Neither phase is sufficient without the other. Neither is more important than the other. They are the two halves of a complete causal process that produces, as its final and inevitable output, the specific physical conditions that correspond to the form the man has clearly, consistently, and faithfully impressed upon the substance that composes them. The full weight of this synthesis can be carried only by a mind that has genuinely, not merely intellectually, accepted the scope of the accountability it implies. There is no portion of the man's conditions that falls outside the governance of this law. There is no category of difficulty, resistance, or apparent limitation that represents an exception to the principle that the substance is producing the conditions that correspond to the dominant impression. This is not a comfortable truth. It is a complete one, and its completeness is precisely the source of its power. Because a law that operates everywhere, on everything, for every man, at every moment, offers something that a partially operative principle never can: total leverage. The man who understands that the entire substance of his physical world is responsive to his thought does not need to find the one lever that might move his particular circumstances. Every circumstance is the substance. Every circumstance is responsive. The leverage is total and unconditional, and the only condition on its use is the precision of the impression with which it is applied. Wallace Wattles gave the world something that most of his contemporaries and virtually all of his successors failed to give it: a reason, not a feeling, not an inspiration, not a narrative of redemption that makes the difficult present bearable by illuminating a hopeful future. A reason, a structural, mechanistic, philosophically grounded account of why the human mind has dominion over the conditions of human life. That reason is the formless substance. The thinking medium that underlies all matter responds to thought with the fidelity of law and produces physical conditions that correspond without deviation and without exception to the dominant impression it receives. Once this reason is truly understood, it does not merely change what the man does. It changes what the man is. Because a man who knows why the law operates cannot unknow it. And a man who cannot unknow it cannot pretend that his conditions are beyond his command. The truth that Wattles encodes in his secret science is not reserved for the exceptional individual. It is not a teaching transmitted only to those with particular spiritual sensitivity, intellectual capacity, or biographical preparation. It is a description of a law, and a law by its nature is impersonal. It holds for every mind that meets its conditions, regardless of the mind's history, its culture, its current circumstances, or the degree to which those circumstances appear to contradict the possibility of what the law promises. The formless substance does not examine the man's past before responding to his present impression. It does not require him to have been already successful before it assists him toward success. It requires precisely what Wattles specifies: the clear image, the faith, the gratitude, and the action. And it delivers, to every mind that meets these conditions, the causal result that follows from them, with the necessity of the geometric conclusion following from the geometric premise. The empowerment that flows from this understanding is not the empowerment of belief. It is the empowerment of knowledge. These are not the same. The man who believes his mind can influence his conditions operates in the hope that a principle he has adopted might prove true in his case. The man who knows his mind commands the substance of his conditions operates from the certainty of a man who has understood the mechanism, who can trace the causal chain from the thought to the substance to the physical result with the same intellectual confidence that a physicist traces the causal chain from the initial conditions of a system to its predictable outcome. This knowledge does not produce enthusiasm. It produces precision, the cold, settled, absolutely reliable precision of a man who knows the law and operates it accordingly. expecting results not because he has summoned the courage to expect them, but because the law gives him no rational ground for expecting anything else. The practical consequence of this knowledge, held with genuine depth, is a specific transformation in the man's relationship to his circumstances. A transformation that is not emotional, but structural. The man who knows the physics does not evaluate his circumstances as good or bad in the conventional sense, as conditions imposed upon him by forces external to his causal agency. He evaluates them as information, as the precise physical readout of the dominant impression he has been making on the formless substance. Every condition, however adverse it appears, is telling him something exact about the quality of his operative impression. Where it has been clear and consistent, the conditions are advancing. Where it has been interrupted by the competitive mind, the conditions are stagnant or regressing. The adverse condition is not an obstacle. It is a diagnostic. The most accurate and the most immediately actionable information available to the man who knows how to read it. This diagnostic relationship to circumstance is the posture of the master. The man who has studied the physics long enough that he reads the physical world the way a physician reads a symptom, not as a final verdict, but as a message from an underlying process that can be influenced, corrected, and redirected by working at the level of its cause. The symptom is real. The physician does not deny it, but he does not treat it as the source of the problem either. And treating the symptom while ignoring the cause is precisely the error that defines the conventional approach to the circumstances of life. The man who knows Wattles' science does not spend his primary energy managing symptoms. He goes to the cause, which is always, without exception, the dominant impression of the mind upon the responsive substance that produces the condition being read as a symptom. At the cause, the leverage is total. At the symptom, the leverage is temporary at best. The masters whose teachings this channel is devoted to preserving and transmitting did not speak to their era alone. They spoke with the authority of men who had identified principles that operate independently of time, culture, and circumstance. Principles that were as true in the era of their articulation as they are in this one, and as they will be in every era that follows, for as long as there is a formless substance and a human mind capable of impressing it. Wattles belongs to this lineage not merely because his ideas are interesting, but because his ideas are correct. Correct in the precise sense of describing a lawful relationship between cause and effect that produces predictable, reproducible, verifiable results in the life of every man who applies it with the exactness it requires. The inheritance he offers is not sentimental. It is operational. It is the complete operating manual for the most powerful instrument available to a human being. And it has been waiting in the pages of a book written at the beginning of the 20th century for the man who is finally ready to use it with the precision it was written to serve. What you have received in this examination of Wattles' secret science is not a summary of his ideas. It is an introduction to a physics, and introductions to physics are not ends in themselves. They are beginnings of a practice. The practice consists of applying, with daily and increasing precision, the principles whose architecture you now understand. The clear image held in the present tense. The consistent impression maintained across the full span of daily thought. The genuine gratitude that reads the evidence of the substance's ongoing response, and the full capacity action that makes the man the physical agent through which the substance delivers its creative product into the world. These are not suggestions for improvement. They are the operating conditions of the law. Apply them exactly. Refine the application as the evidence instructs. Expect the results that the law produces, because the law produces them for every mind that meets its conditions. The substance of your world is listening. It has always been listening. The only remaining question is whether the thought it receives from this point forward will be the thought you have chosen, or the thought that chose you in the absence of that choice. There is a thinking stuff from which all things are made, and which, in its original state, permeates, penetrates, and fills the interspaces of the universe. A thought in this substance produces the thing that is imaged by the thought. Man can form things in his thought, and by impressing his thought upon formless substance, can cause the thing he thinks about to be created. These are Wallace Wattles' own words, written in 1910. When the dominant intellectual culture of the Western world was in the early decades of its commitment to the mechanical universe. They were not written as poetry. They were written as the central axiom of a precise physics, the foundational claim from which every other principle in Wattles' science follows with logical necessity. Read them again, not as a passage from an old book, but as a statement of the law that is operating in the substance of your conditions right now. The thinking stuff permeates your environment. Every formed thing in your life is a specific condensation of it. A thought in that substance produces the corresponding form. Your thoughts are in that substance, have always been in that substance. And the forms they have been impressing upon it have been produced with the fidelity of law throughout the entire course of your life, whether you understood this or not. The question that Wattles places before the man who has read this far is not whether the law is true. The question is what, now that you know the law, you intend to do with the knowledge. The substance of your physical world is listening to your mind right now. This is not a metaphor. It is not an aspiration. It is the precise, physical, operative fact of your existence at this moment, and at every moment that precedes and follows it. The substance has never stopped listening. It listened when you doubted, and it produced conditions that corresponded to the doubt. It listened when you feared, and it produced conditions that corresponded to the fear. It listened when, however briefly and however imperfectly, you held a clear and faith-maintained image of a better form. And it moved toward that form with the same lawful fidelity it gave to every other impression it received. The record of your conditions is the record of its obedience. Every formation in your life, every opportunity, every obstacle, every persistent pattern of result is the substance having executed, faithfully and without exception, the instruction it was given by the dominant thought of the mind it reads. The only question remaining, the only question that has ever mattered in the entire scope of Wattles' science, is whether the thought the substance is obeying at this moment is the thought you chose, or the thought that chose you by default. This is the question that every man who has arrived at genuine understanding of the physics must answer in the privacy of his own examination of his dominant mental state. Not the thought he believes he is thinking. Not the thought he would like to be thinking. The thought that is actually, consistently, persistently, most deeply and most automatically present in the background of his daily awareness. The thought whose physical expression he can read, with the diagnostic eye of a man who knows the physics, in the present state of his conditions. If that thought is the thought of the form he intends to produce, he is operating the law. If it is the thought of competitive anxiety, of scarcity, of doubt in the substance's responsiveness, he is also operating the law and will continue to receive, with perfect and impersonal precision, the conditions that correspond to it. Take command of the impression. This is not a motivational instruction. It is a technical one. The impression is already being made, at this moment and every moment. Taking command means nothing more and nothing less than ensuring that the impression being made corresponds to the form you intend the substance to produce. Ensuring that the dominant thought you carry, at the most consistent and the most automatic level of your mental life, is the specific, present tense, faith-held image of the conditions you are instructing the formless substance to create. Hold that impression with precision, not with the forced intensity of a man trying to believe something he doubts, but with the settled confidence of a man who has understood the law and trusts it the way a physicist trusts the mathematics he has derived from first principles. Trust the physics. It does not fail. It does not make exceptions. It does not reserve its results for a different class of man. It operates for every mind that meets its conditions. And it operates right now, for yours. Write in the comments the words, "Matter obeys my mind." Write them not as a declaration of aspiration, but as a statement of the fact you have understood in this examination of Wattles' secret science. The fact that the substance of the physical world has always obeyed the dominant thought of your mind, is obeying it at this moment, and will continue to obey it with perfect fidelity for every moment of your life that follows. Write it as a man who has read the physics, understood the mechanism, and accepted the full scope of the accountability and the power that understanding entails. Subscribe to this channel, because the archive of teachings preserved here and the teachings yet to be examined are the work of men who spent their lives mapping the same territory this science describes. The territory of the relationship between the human mind and the substance of the world it inhabits. Every map we examine here adds precision to the one you already carry, and the more precisely you know the territory, the more exactly you can navigate it toward the forms you intend by the law that was always yours to operate, in the substance that has always been listening for the command you are only now learning to give with the exactness it deserves.